Imagine standing on a lonely Greek plain. 6,400 Persians lie dead before you, your comrades drenched in sweat and victory. And you realize you've just saved the very idea of freedom itself. The first light of dawn in September of 490 BC spilled across the rolling plains near the Bay of Marathon, casting long shadows over a land that, at first glance, seemed serene. The olive trees swayed gently in the cool morning breeze. The distant sea lapped softly against the shoreline, and the soft clatter of hooves echoed faintly from the cavalry scouting the horizon. But beneath this pastoral calm, a storm of human ambition and destiny was about to erupt, a storm that would forever alter the trajectory of Western civilization. On these plains, a relatively small contingent of Athenian hoplites stood ready to confront an invading force far larger, a Persian army under Datis and Artaphernes, whose mission was nothing less than the subjugation of all of Greece. The stakes could not have been higher: the survival of the fledgling experiment in democracy in Athens, the independence of city-states across the Greek peninsula, and the very notion that free men could govern themselves hung in the balance. The Athenians, numbering roughly 10,000 with the addition of a small contingent from Plataea, faced a Persian army estimated at 25,000 to 30,000, elite archers, swift cavalry, and infantry accustomed to sweeping across continents. For every Athenian soldier, there were at least 2 or 3 Persian opponents. And yet the Athenians did not falter. Here lay the crucible of courage and ingenuity, a defining moment in which strategy, terrain, and sheer resolve would outweigh numerical superiority. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. The soldiers, clad in bronze breastplates that gleamed in the rising sun, tightened their grips on spears tipped with iron, the wooden shafts smooth from constant polishing. Helmets adorned with horsehair plumes bobbed as officers inspected their lines. The air was a mix of dust, sweat, and the tang of metal. Behind them, the city of Athens stood silent but vigilant, its marble walls glinting faintly as if bearing witness to the impending clash. From a hilltop, a scout glimpsed the Persian lines approaching, shimmering banners in reds and blues, cavalry in coordinated columns, the distant rumble of marching feet that seemed to shake the very earth. A messenger had arrived the night before, breathless, warning that the Persian fleet had already been sighted near the coast. Panic could have been justified. Indeed, many Greek city-states had cowered in the shadow of Persia's unstoppable force. But Athens had chosen a different path. Here was a city committed not merely to survival, but to the principles of self-governance, the ideals of liberty, the fragile beginnings of what history would later call democracy. This battle was no mere skirmish for land or plunder. It was a defense of an idea. Legends would later tell of the valor displayed on the plain of Marathon. Stories whispered from the streets of Athens to the columns of the Parthenon centuries later. One account speaks of a single Athenian soldier who, in the moments before battle, prayed silently at a small shrine to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. He traced the contour of her carved face, seeking courage. The historian Herodotus would recount these details with reverence, noting how the Athenian resolve was as much a moral and spiritual victory as a military one. The tension in the air was palpable. Even the birds seemed to pause mid-flight, and the waves lapped more softly, as though nature itself anticipated the unfolding drama. Commands echoed, the rhythm of shields clashing lightly in practice drills forming a steady drumbeat, like the heartbeat of a city on the brink. In this prelude to combat there was no triumph, only expectation, fear, and determination. It was here, in this quiet before the storm, that history held its breath. The Persian Empire, vast and imposing, had never faced such an organized, motivated, and ideologically committed opposition. The Athenians, on the other hand, were defenders not of an empire but of a way of life, and in that resolve lay a hidden advantage that could tip the scales of fate. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the golden plains and distant waves, the stage was set. When the armies finally collided, the world would witness a clash whose echoes would resonate for millennia. A battle whose outcome would determine whether democracy, in its earliest form, would survive or be extinguished before it could truly flourish. The plains of Marathon were ready. The moment had arrived. And in that instant, history poised itself on the edge of a spear, waiting to see which side would seize destiny. The seeds of conflict that culminated at Marathon had been sown decades before, stretching back to the ambitions of one empire and the resilience of a culture that prized independence above all else. By 490 BC, the Persian Empire under Darius V had already established itself as a behemoth of the ancient world, a force that spanned from the icy reaches of the Danube to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. It was an empire defined by vast wealth, centralized authority, and a sophisticated system of satrapies, where governors collected tribute and maintained order for the king. Persia's military, disciplined and formidable, could sweep across continents with remarkable efficiency. For Darius, Greece represented both a target and a threat. The city-states, though small and fragmented, had dared to resist Persian domination in the Ionian Revolt, 4999 to 493 BC, an uprising supported covertly by Athens and Eretria. The Ionian Revolt was the spark. The Greek cities of Ionia, along the western coast of modern-day Turkey, had risen against Persian governors in a struggle for autonomy. Athens sent a fleet to support the rebels, burning the Persian regional capital of Sardis, a bold, incendiary act that did not go unnoticed by the emperor. From the Persian perspective, Athens had become a provocateur, a thorn in the side of an empire that tolerated little defiance. Revenge was inevitable. Across the Aegean, Athens was a city in transition. The early 5th century BC saw the consolidation of the radical democratic reforms of Cleisthenes, who had restructured the citizen body and created new political institutions that gave free male citizens unprecedented influence over governance. It was a fragile system, young and untested, yet it had imbued the Athenians with a sense of identity and purpose. Their polis was not merely a collection of buildings and markets. It was a community defined by participation, debate, and shared responsibility. To be conquered by Persia was not only a military threat, it was an existential threat to their political experiment. By the spring of 490 BC, intelligence reports confirmed that Persian forces were preparing a large-scale expedition against mainland Greece. Darius I's plan was ambitious, a coordinated strike aimed at punishing Athens and Eretria, subjugating the Greek cities, and sending a clear message of imperial supremacy. The Persians had marshaled a fleet of hundreds of triremes, ships that could carry soldiers and horses swiftly across the Aegean, alongside thousands of infantry and cavalry trained to operate in both open plains and coastal assaults. For the Greeks, the disparity in numbers was staggering. Some estimates suggest that the Persian force outnumbered the Athenians by 2 or 3 to 1. Yet the Athenians and their ally Plataea understood that geography, morale, and discipline could offset numerical superiority. The broader Greek world was watching, and not without concern. Sparta, the militaristic powerhouse to the south, had been slow to respond, constrained by religious observances and internal politics. Other city-states debated neutrality or alliance, weighing the costs of confrontation against the perils of submission. In this environment of uncertainty, Athens had to act decisively. Their leaders, Miltiades, a general of noble lineage and a veteran of campaigns in the Persian sphere, and the Council of Strategoi faced impossible choices. Delay risked allowing the Persians to consolidate, while engagement meant confronting overwhelming odds on a plain with few natural defenses. The terrain itself played a subtle yet critical role in the calculus of war. The Bay of Marathon, a narrow coastal plain flanked by marshes on one side and hills on the other, offered a unique battlefield. Its geography prevented the Persians from fully deploying their cavalry and limited the effectiveness of their archers, giving the Greek phalanx an edge in close combat. This was no accident. The Athenians understood their homeland intimately, and the choice of engagement location was as strategic as any formation or weapon. Amid these geopolitical and military pressures, rumors and reports shaped decisions and morale. Persian emissaries had traveled to Greek city-states, offering riches and protection in exchange for submission. Athens had famously rejected these overtures, sending back a single, uncompromising message: "We shall fight for our freedom." Within the city, citizens prepared both physically and mentally. Drums of rhetoric and speeches in the agora stoked civic pride, while practical measures ensured that every hoplite was armored and every levy accounted for. Families knew the cost of the coming battle, yet they rallied behind the idea that their city's independence was worth any sacrifice. Thus, Marathon was not an isolated encounter. It was the culmination of decades of tension, of rebellions, of imperial ambition and local defiance. It represented a collision between a sprawling empire accustomed to obedience and a society that had learned to prize debate, civic responsibility, and freedom. In understanding this context, the battlefield becomes more than dirt and grass. It becomes a theater of ideology, a place where the future of governance, culture, and identity would be contested as fiercely as territory itself. As dawn approached on that fateful September morning, every Athenian hoplite, every Plataean ally, every Persian soldier carried not only weapons and armor, but also the weight of history. The stage was set. The stakes could not have been higher. And the world, though oblivious at the time, was about to witness a turning point that would echo through millennia. The fight for freedom against tyranny, for democracy against empire. The Athenians' march toward destiny began long before swords clashed and arrows flew. Preparation at Marathon was as much about psychology, discipline, and strategy as it was about physical readiness. In the weeks leading up to the battle, the Athenians and their Plataean allies engaged in meticulous drills, inspections, and tactical discussions that would determine whether their small force could survive and triumph against the might of Persia. Miltiades, the commanding general, understood the importance of morale. He knew that courage alone could not defeat numbers, and that hesitation could be fatal. The hoplites trained rigorously, advancing and retreating in tight formations, learning to maneuver as a single entity rather than as isolated fighters. Spears were polished to a gleaming point, shields reinforced with bronze edging, and armor meticulously inspected. Every soldier practiced the phalanx's deadly advance, a wall of overlapping shields, bristling spears projecting outward like the quills of a porcupine, designed to hold the line and crush opponents in unison. Terrain, too, dictated preparation. The plains of Marathon offered advantages if leveraged correctly. A narrow coastal strip limited the effectiveness of Persian cavalry, and flanking hills could protect against encirclement. Miltiades positioned his forces to maximize these features, leaving marshy land on the flanks as natural barriers. He reduced the center of his line to prevent being overextended while thickening the wings to allow the Greeks to envelop the enemy, a maneuver that would later prove decisive. The Athenians also engaged in psychological preparation. Soldiers were reminded not only of their civic duty, but of the existential stakes. Athens' survival, the preservation of their democratic experiment, and the defense of Greek liberty itself. Priests and oracles were consulted, sacrifices offered, and small shrines visited. Soldiers murmured prayers to Athena and Ares, seeking both wisdom and courage. Legend has it that some veterans carried talismans or inscriptions invoking ancestral heroes. Tangible links to a shared heritage meant to steel their resolve. Meanwhile, Persian forces had their own rituals and preparations. Datis and Artaphernes oversaw the training of thousands of infantry, archers, and cavalry. Persian archers, trained in rapid volleys, practiced firing en masse to create a storm of arrows. Cavalry units rehearsed flanking maneuvers, understanding the open terrain would favor their mobility. Yet despite their superior numbers, the Persians faced challenges in logistics, maintaining supply lines across the Aegean, coordinating a multi-ethnic army, and adjusting tactics to unfamiliar Greek terrain. Unlike the Athenians, whose intimate knowledge of the plain allowed flexible strategy, the Persian army relied heavily on standard formations and the might of overwhelming force. Civilians also played a subtle but meaningful role. From rooftops and hilltops, Athenian families watched the procession of hoplites, their chants and prayers providing morale boosts. Children waved simple banners, while women prepared provisions and water for the soldiers. The air hummed with anticipation, the scent of oil from polished armor mingling with the salty tang of the nearby sea. Every human presence contributed to a collective sense that history was being made, that this was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible where the fate of a people would be decided. Intelligence and reconnaissance were equally vital. Scouts and light cavalry were dispatched to monitor Persian movements, recording formations, counting numbers, and noting supply wagons. Rumors and reports flowed back to Miltiades, who weighed each piece of information carefully, knowing that misinformation could be as deadly as an enemy charge. He prepared contingencies. If the Persians attempted to retreat or outflank, the Greek line could adjust. If the center was pressured, reserves could reinforce the wings. Every soldier's position had been calculated, every possibility imagined. Even ceremonial preparations carried significance. Banners were raised, standards inspected, and trumpets practiced, the rhythm and pageantry of the army serving both practical and symbolic purposes. For soldiers, these acts reinforced identity and unity. For the Persians, the sight of disciplined Greek formations might have been unsettling, a contrast to the more loosely coordinated contingents of their empire. The Athenians were not just preparing weapons, they were preparing minds, forging a collective will capable of confronting an empire. As the hours wore on, tension mounted. The plain of Marathon, bathed in early sunlight, seemed deceptively tranquil. Wind stirred the banners, and the faint hum of preparation, the clang of bronze, the shuffle of sandals on dirt, murmured prayers, formed a quiet, anticipatory cadence. By now, every Athenian hoplite understood the cost of hesitation, the price of fear, and the weight of responsibility. The Persians were advancing steadily, unaware that the Athenians' meticulous preparation would allow them to turn the terrain and their cohesion into a decisive advantage. It was a moment of stark contrast. On one side, the sprawling, confident might of the Persian Empire. On the other, a disciplined, determined citizen army defending not just land, but ideals, community, and self-determination. The stage was set, the pieces in place, and the tension reached a near unbearable crescendo. The first clash, when it came, would not merely be the sound of weapons meeting, it would be the collision of ideology, strategy, and destiny. The sun had fully risen over the Bay of Marathon, turning the plains into a sea of gold when the two armies faced each other across the dusty expanse. For a moment, the air seemed to stand still, as if the gods themselves were watching. On the Greek side, the Athenian and Plataean hoplites shifted in formation, shields interlocking, spears angled forward, plumes swaying with the wind. Across the field, the Persians lined up in gleaming ranks. A formidable wall of archers, cavalry, and lightly armored infantry, their banners snapping crisply in the morning breeze. Miltiades, standing at the center of the Greek line, surveyed the enemy. He had made a bold decision to weaken the center of his phalanx and reinforce the wings, preparing to envelop the Persians once the engagement began. He knew the Persian advantage lay in their numbers and cavalry, and he intended to neutralize both with terrain and timing. The Athenian soldiers, aware of the plan, gritted their teeth and adjusted shields, the tension between fear and courage palpable in every stance. At a signal, a trumpet or a shouted command, the Greeks surged forward. Unlike many battles of the era, where engagements began with volleys of arrows or prolonged skirmishing, the Athenians charged at a run, closing the distance in an astonishing act of audacity. The dust rose in thick clouds, the earth trembling under the thundering footsteps of armored men. Spears braced, shields locked, and the rhythmic chant of soldiers, barely audible above the roar of approaching combat, formed a heartbeat of determination. The initial clash occurred at the Greek wings, where Miltiades' strategy aimed to envelop the enemy. Greek hoplites pressed hard against the Persian flanks, engaging in brutal, close-quarter combat. Spears struck shields and armor with deafening clangs. Helmets deflected arrows and blows alike. The Persians, though lightly armored and trained for mobility, found themselves trapped in a crushing formation, unable to maneuver their cavalry effectively across the narrow plain. The sound of battle, shouts, the clash of bronze, the cries of the wounded filled the air, blending with the whip of the wind and the faint crash of waves on the nearby shore. In the center, the thinner Greek line held against the Persian push. Hoplites staggered under pressure, shields splintered, spears knocked aside, but discipline held. Each man's survival depended not just on his skill, but on the soldier beside him. The phalanx was a living organism, advancing as one, retreating as one, absorbing the shock of superior numbers, while the stronger wings began their enveloping maneuver. The Persians, sensing the encirclement, attempted to adjust, but coordination across their diverse units was slow, and the terrain limited their cavalry's options. Amid this chaos, small human dramas unfolded. One Athenian soldier, cut off momentarily, fought his way back into formation, driven not just by training, but by the knowledge that retreat meant dishonor and potential death. A Plataean ally, struck by an arrow, continued to press forward with his comrades, embodying the communal spirit that defined the Greek defense. From the Persian side, young recruits, unaccustomed to such disciplined resistance, faltered and fell, their cries swallowed by the din of battle. The turning point came when the Greek wings, now fully engaged, began to envelop the Persian flanks, collapsing inward like the jaws of a trap. The center, previously under pressure, found itself supported as the Persian line began to buckle under coordinated strikes from both sides. Miltiades' gamble was paying off. Numerical inferiority was offset by tactical ingenuity. Greek shields locked, spears thrust forward with lethal precision, and the Persians, for all their numbers, were now caught in a deadly vice as the battle wore on. Fatigue and fear spread through the Persian ranks. Their archers, unable to fire effectively at close range, ceased to be a factor. Cavalry units, constrained by marshes and tightly packed infantry, could not charge decisively. Greek discipline, cohesion, and knowledge of the terrain triumphed over Persian bravado and size. By midday, the Persian line was breaking, men fleeing toward the coast and their ships, leaving behind the wounded, the dead, and the weight of humiliation. Throughout the field, the sensory overload was overwhelming. The metallic tang of blood mingled with the dust of the plains. The heat of exertion clashed with the crisp morning breeze. The cries of combatants, the shouts of commanders, and the occasional groan of a wounded horse formed a cacophony of life and death. For those watching from the hills, the scene was both horrific and awe-inspiring, a display of human courage and suffering intertwined. Victory, when it came, was decisive. The Athenians had routed the Persians, sending them back to their ships with heavy casualties, estimated at around 6,400 dead, compared to 192 Athenian fatalities. The battlefield, littered with fallen soldiers and shattered weapons, bore silent testimony to the intensity of the encounter. Miltiades and the Greek command ensured that fleeing Persians were pursued only to a certain extent, limiting overextension, while simultaneously securing the plain and salvaging arms for future defense. The human cost was staggering, but the psychological impact was even greater. The Athenians had faced a mighty empire and prevailed, confirming that discipline, strategy, and civic resolve could outweigh sheer numbers. The battle also sent a powerful message to the rest of Greece. Persia was not invincible, and the defense of liberty was achievable. Across the peninsula, word of the victory spread rapidly, inspiring both relief and admiration. As evening fell, the plains of Marathon were silent again, save for the groans of the wounded and the faint crackle of fires tending to the dead. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The Athenians, exhausted but unbroken, surveyed their hard-won victory, knowing that while this battle was won, the war against Persia was far from over. Yet at that moment, the tide of history had shifted, and the fragile dream of democracy in Athens had survived another day. As the sun sank behind the distant hills, the plains of Marathon transformed from a stage of clashing armies into a grim tableau of aftermath. The silence was heavy, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the occasional distant call of a bird. Bodies littered the earth, Athenians, Plataeans, Persians alike, each a testament to courage and the brutal calculus of war. The Athenians moved quickly, collecting their dead, tending the injured, and salvaging arms and armor where possible. Even in victory, the city-state faced the sobering reality of mortality, the sharp contrast between strategic triumph and human cost. The Athenians had suffered a remarkably low number of casualties, around 192 killed, testament to their disciplined phalanx, the tactical genius of Miltiades, and the advantage of fighting on familiar terrain. The Persians, by contrast, had endured losses estimated at roughly 6,400. Their retreat to the shoreline and eventual embarkation onto ships marked both a military defeat and a psychological blow. An empire that had never before faced such a setback now confronted the limits of its reach. In Athens, news of the victory spread like wildfire. The city erupted with celebration, prayers of gratitude, and public recognition of the soldiers' valor. The agora became a theater of triumph. Citizens gathered to honor fallen heroes. Priests conducted rituals of thanksgiving to Athena, and Miltiades received acclaim as the man who had steered Athens through peril. Yet amidst the rejoicing, there was an undercurrent of reflection. Families who had lost sons and husbands grieved quietly, understanding that even in victory, the shadow of war left scars impossible to erase. Strategically, Marathon had immediate consequences. The Persian plan to punish Athens and demonstrate imperial might had failed spectacularly. Their defeat disrupted supply lines, sapped morale, and exposed vulnerabilities in both planning and execution. For the Greeks, the message was clear. Persia could be resisted, even by city-states whose armies were smaller, provided discipline, unity, and knowledge of terrain were leveraged effectively. The Athenians' bold choice to engage, rather than wait defensively behind walls, had paid off, demonstrating the decisive power of initiative and audacious strategy. Across Greece, reactions were varied. Sparta, which had arrived too late to participate due to a sacred festival delaying their mobilization, received news with a mixture of relief and envy. Other city-states took note of the effectiveness of the phalanx and the benefits of cohesive citizen armies. The battle began to shift perceptions of warfare and the balance of power, instilling confidence that Persia's empire was not invincible. The morale boost was intangible yet potent, reinforcing alliances and encouraging unity among the often fractious Greek city-states. On the Persian side, the defeat sowed shock and reconsideration. Datis and Artaphernes returned to their ships, reporting the setback to Darius I. The emperor's plans for immediate conquest were delayed, and a re-evaluation of military strategy became necessary. The empire's reach was vast, but Marathon revealed the limits of conventional strength against unconventional, well-organized resistance. For Persia, the battle was a lesson in underestimating the human spirit. Local knowledge and the capacity of small, motivated forces to resist even the mightiest of armies. The physical landscape of Marathon itself bore the scars of the encounter. Trampled fields, broken spears, shattered shields, and bloodied armor marked every step across the plain. Marshlands had been churned by cavalry, hills dotted with observers' footprints, and the shoreline littered with equipment abandoned in retreat. In the immediate aftermath, the battlefield became both a place of memory and a stark reminder of war's toll, a site where survival, strategy, and courage intersected with death and destruction. Psychologically, the Athenians emerged hardened but emboldened. They had faced overwhelming odds and triumphed, reinforcing civic pride and collective identity. For a democracy so young, the victory affirmed not only their military capabilities, but also the legitimacy of their political system. Citizens fighting for shared ideals could withstand the mightiest of empires. This sense of moral and ideological validation would resonate far beyond the plains of Marathon, shaping Greek thought, culture, and political confidence for generations. As dusk fell, the surviving soldiers rested on the battlefield, the cries of the injured slowly fading, replaced by the quiet hum of the sea and the whisper of wind through olive trees. Athens had survived, and with it, the fragile dream of democracy endured. But the war was not over. The Persian Empire would regroup, reassess, and return. Marathon was a victory, yes, but also a prelude to larger confrontations that would continue to test courage, strategy, and the will of a people determined to remain free. The echoes of Marathon reverberated far beyond the rolling plains where bronze clashed with iron and valor confronted empire. Its significance extended not merely through military success, but into the very heart of civilization, shaping the trajectory of Greek politics, culture, and the future of Western thought. In defeating the Persians, the Athenians had not only preserved their city, but had safeguarded an experiment in democracy that at that moment was fragile, young, and untested. Politically, the victory fortified Athens' position among the Greek city-states. Previously a regional power of modest influence, Athens' success elevated it to prominence, fostering alliances and inspiring admiration. The city's leaders, Miltiades, first among strategoi, gained prestige and authority, reinforcing the credibility of citizen-soldier governance. This triumph also provided a precedent. Collective civic action, disciplined preparation, and decisive leadership could triumph over numerically superior foes. Such lessons would shape Athens' strategic choices in the years to come, influencing not only military engagements but also the development of naval power, infrastructure, and civic identity. For the wider Greek world, Marathon became symbolic of resistance against tyranny. Though individual city-states had long maintained their independence, Persia's looming shadow had instilled fear and uncertainty. Marathon demonstrated that coordinated effort, strategy, and morale could counter even the most formidable empire. Sparta, Corinth, and other allies began to recognize the value of cooperation in defense, planting the seeds for future pan-Hellenic responses against Persia. The psychological boost cannot be overstated. The perception of Persian invincibility was shattered, and confidence surged among city-states, contemplating their autonomy in the face of imperial ambition. Strategically, Marathon influenced military theory and practice. The battle illustrated the power of terrain selection, the phalanx's effectiveness against larger, less cohesive forces, and the decisive potential of enveloping maneuvers. Future Greek commanders studied Marathon as an example of how audacity, disciplined cohesion, and intimate knowledge of the battlefield could overcome overwhelming odds. For the Persians, the loss was a cautionary tale of overextension and the perils of underestimating local intelligence and resistance. Darius I, having witnessed firsthand the vulnerability of his forces, would plan subsequent campaigns with more caution, eventually leading to the massive invasion under Xerxes 2 decades later. Culturally and socially, Marathon became a touchstone of collective memory. Songs, poems, and public recounting celebrated the bravery of citizens who had defended their polis. The battle entered the lexicon of Greek heroism. Individuals fought not for glory alone, but for community, for shared ideals, and for the preservation of civic structures that allowed citizen participation. Over time, the plain of Marathon became a site of remembrance, inspiring generations and reinforcing the concept that history could be shaped by deliberate human choice rather than sheer force. Economically, the victory provided immediate stability. With the Persian fleet repelled, Athens avoided occupation, pillaging, and tribute, allowing trade, agriculture, and civic projects to continue uninterrupted. This stability enabled the city to invest in fortifications, naval expansion, and urban development, laying foundations for the golden age of Athens in the 5th century BC. Had Marathon fallen differently, the political and economic trajectory of the region could have been profoundly altered, perhaps delaying or preventing the cultural flowering of classical Athens. Speculatively, one can imagine the what-ifs that hung over Marathon. Had the Athenians hesitated, been overrun, or fractured under pressure, the Persian Empire might have secured a foothold in mainland Greece. Democracy in Athens could have been crushed before it matured. The philosophical, artistic, and political innovations that defined classical civilization might have been suppressed under imperial rule. Marathon, in this sense, was not only a military victory, but a pivotal historical fulcrum, tipping the balance between autocracy and self-determination. In practical terms, the long-term legacy of Marathon shaped both military and civic ethos. It demonstrated the integration of strategy, training, morale, and terrain into a coherent approach that could defy overwhelming odds. It reinforced the concept that citizen soldiers defending a shared cause could achieve extraordinary results, and perhaps most enduringly, it established a narrative that freedom and governance by the people, fragile though they were, could survive against the most imposing forces, a narrative that would echo through Greek history and into the modern imagination. By the end of the 5th century BC, Marathon was more than a battlefield. It was a symbol. Monuments, dedications, and annual commemorations honored those who fought, embedding the event into the civic consciousness. The strategic, political, and cultural effects rippled through the decades, shaping alliances, military reforms, and democratic confidence. For historians, Marathon represents a lesson in foresight, preparation, and audacity, an engagement where the human spirit and civic responsibility intersected to alter the course of history. Marathon stands as more than a military engagement. It is a testament to human courage, strategic ingenuity, and the enduring power of ideas. In facing a seemingly insurmountable foe, the Athenians demonstrated that preparation, unity, and moral conviction could offset numerical disadvantage. The victory was decisive not merely because of the battlefield outcome, but because it safeguarded the fragile experiment of democracy in Athens, ensuring that self-governance, civic responsibility, and collective action survived to flourish in the centuries that followed. From a strategic standpoint, Marathon offers lessons in leadership, adaptability, and the exploitation of terrain and morale. Miltiades' audacious choice to weaken the center and strengthen the wings, the disciplined coordination of citizen soldiers, and the careful selection of battlefield location collectively reveal the power of foresight and calculated risk. It underscores that military success is rarely determined by numbers alone. Cohesion, timing, and understanding of the human element can decisively shape outcomes. The battle also highlights the intersection of ideology and warfare. The Athenians were not fighting solely for land or resources. They were defending principles, a way of life that privileged citizen participation and civic freedom. In doing so, they infused their soldiers with purpose beyond survival, creating a psychological edge over a Persian army operating more as a tool of empire than as a community united by shared ideals. The human element, motivation, morale, and belief, proved as lethal as any weapon. Marathon's legacy extends beyond strategy and politics into the realm of cultural memory. It became a touchstone of Greek identity, a narrative of resilience against overwhelming odds that would inspire generations. Annual commemorations, dedications, and artistic representations reinforced its significance, embedding the battle into the collective imagination. Marathon demonstrated that historical memory is not only a record of events, but a tool for shaping civic values, teaching courage, responsibility, and the importance of defending freedom. Contemporary parallels are also striking. Modern leaders and societies can draw lessons from Marathon about preparation under pressure, the importance of adaptability, and the moral dimension of collective action. In an age of advanced technology and complex warfare, the fundamental principles of discipline, cohesion, and clarity of purpose remain relevant. Marathon reminds us that success often stems not from raw power but from unity, insight, and commitment to a shared cause. Finally, Marathon compels reflection on the fragility and resilience of human institutions. Had the outcome been different, the trajectory of Western civilization and the survival of democracy itself might have been altered irrevocably. The battle exemplifies how a single encounter, fought with determination and strategy, can reverberate through centuries, shaping the political, cultural, and philosophical foundations of society. As we stand on the plains of Marathon in imagination, viewing the sun-dappled hills, the remnants of armor, and the shadow of human endeavor, one truth remains clear. History is shaped by those who act decisively in moments of crisis. The courage of the Athenians, the vision of their leaders, and the resilience of a community united by ideals transformed a local conflict into a turning point for humanity. Marathon was not only a battle, it was a defining statement of what a free people can achieve, a beacon of hope and a testament to the enduring power of democracy.